Have you ever noticed how we spend our entire lives chasing truths we rarely question? We think we know reality, that we understand how the world works and our place within it. But what if I told you that much of what you consider absolute truth is nothing more than a collective illusion, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the chaos of existence? This is not a rhetorical question. It's an invitation to look together beyond the layers of stories we've been told since birth. You might be thinking, another conspiracy theory, another person trying to convince me of some hidden truth. It's not that. I'm not here to replace your illusions with new ones. I'm here to explore how the stories that shape our perception of reality work and how we can develop a more conscious relationship with them. If you're still watching this video, maybe it's because something within you has already sensed that there's more to reality than what our social consensuses allow us to see. You're not wrong. For thousands of years, human beings have lived simultaneously in two worlds. The physical, objective world of rivers, mountains, and predators, and the imagined world of stories, gods, nations, and corporations. The first world existed long before us and will continue after we're gone. The second exists only because we collectively believe in it. But here lies the fascinating paradox. Although the world of stories is a human creation, it has come to completely dominate the physical world. A lion cannot be persuaded to change its behavior because of a story. But billions of humans can be mobilized for war to build entire civilizations or to destroy them only because of the stories they believe in. And the most astonishing thing is that most of us don't even realize we are under the spell of these narratives. Let's go back to the origin of these stories. Around 70,000 years ago, our species underwent a cognitive revolution that gave us the unique ability to create and believe in shared fictions. This ability allowed us to cooperate in large numbers and dominate the planet. Before that, we were just another primate species living in small groups, as many animals do. What turned us into masters of the planet wasn't our physical strength or even our individual intelligence, but our unprecedented capacity to create stories that many people could believe in simultaneously. Money, gods, nations, human rights, corporations, all these powerful entities that govern our lives do not exist in the physical world. They exist only as intersubjective constructions, as stories we collectively believe in. A monkey cannot be convinced to give up its banana in exchange for a piece of paper called money. But you and I do that every day because we share the belief in the story of money. What's particularly interesting about these stories is that although they are human creations, we've come to treat them as if they were objective realities, laws of nature that cannot be questioned. When someone says they don't believe in the nation they were born into, or in the value of money, or in the laws of society, we don't say they're rejecting a story. We say they're crazy, dangerous, or at least naive. The most powerful stories are the ones we forget are stories. They are the ones we start to treat as reality itself. And here we reach a crucial point. In the information age, stories have multiplied and fragmented. While our hunter-gatherer ancestors shared basically the same stories, today we are exposed to an unprecedented number of competing narratives. Some people live in the story that material success is the ultimate goal of life. Others live in the story that only spiritual development matters. Some believe science is the only path to truth. Others see science as just another story, not necessarily more valid than ancient myths. And the internet has amplified this cacophony of stories to a level we've never experienced before. The result is a world where many people feel a deep crisis of meaning. If all stories are mere constructions, which one should I believe? If my identity, my values, and my life goals are all based on stories, what remains when I begin to question those stories? And here is the truth. Few are ready to face. There is no definitive answer to these questions. There is no universal story that is objectively true and gives meaning to all human lives. Every story has its strengths and limitations. Each illuminates certain aspects of the human experience while obscuring others. Take, for example, the predominant story of our time, the story of perpetual economic growth and consumerism as the path to happiness. This story tells us that if we keep producing and consuming more each year, eventually we'll all be happy and fulfilled. It's a powerful story that has mobilized billions of people, transformed entire ecosystems, and reshaped the face of the planet. But it's also a story that's leading to massive environmental destruction, exhaustion of finite resources, and, ironically, growing levels of loneliness, anxiety, and depression. Or consider the story of modern individualism, which tells us that we are autonomous, separate entities who must seek our own satisfaction and fulfillment. This story has liberated many people from the restrictions of traditional hierarchies. But it has also left us more isolated, more disconnected from meaningful communities, and more vulnerable to existential emptiness. I'm not suggesting that we should abandon all stories and live in some imaginary state of pure perception of reality. That would be impossible for humans. We need stories to make sense of the world and to coordinate our actions. The question is not how to live without stories, but how to develop a more conscious and flexible relationship with them. To recognize that stories are tools, not absolute truths, that we can choose which stories best serve our purposes in different contexts, that we can revise and update our stories when they stop serving human well-being. This awareness of stories as stories and not as absolute reality is what I call narrative meta-consciousness. It's the ability to perceive the narratives that shape our perception, to critically examine their effects on our lives, and to modify them when necessary. This meta-consciousness is particularly crucial in our historical moment, as information technologies are radically transforming how stories are created and disseminated. Think about how much the internet and social media have changed our relationship with stories. In the past, dominant narratives were controlled by a relatively small number of institutions, governments, churches, universities, major media outlets. Today, anyone with internet access can create and spread their own narratives, challenging the monopoly of traditional institutions over the construction of social reality. This has created an explosion of new stories, some inspiring, others dangerous, all competing for our attention and belief. At the same time, artificial intelligence algorithms analyze our online behavior and show us the stories most likely to capture our attention, regardless of their truth or usefulness. The result is a fragmented informational landscape where different groups of people effectively live in different constructed realities with little dialogue between them. The same events are interpreted in radically different ways depending on the prior stories we accept as true. And the more we cling to our preferred stories, the harder it becomes to understand the perspectives of those who live within other narratives. This is one of the factors behind the growing political and social polarization we see in many countries. Moreover, the increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence in generating content is beginning to blur the line between human and machine-created stories. It's already possible for AIs to generate texts, images, and videos that are practically indistinguishable from those created by humans. In the near future, we may be consuming AI-generated stories without even realizing it. This raises profound questions about authenticity, control, and meaning in an era where the very stories shaping our perception of reality may no longer be human creations. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we're discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that many of us keep these worries to ourselves, perhaps afraid of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My biggest fear about our technological future is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine paths to confront them. But technological transformations are only part of the story. We are also facing unprecedented environmental crises, from climate change to the massive loss of biodiversity and widespread pollution. Our economic system, based on perpetual growth, is colliding with the physical limits of a finite planet. And our politics, still organized mainly around the nation state, struggles to deal with problems that are inherently global. In the face of these multiple and interconnected challenges, the old stories seem increasingly inadequate. The story of continuous technological and economic progress as the path to utopia is proving unsustainable. The story of the isolated individual pursuing personal happiness is leaving us empty. The story of human domination over nature is leading us toward ecological disaster. And even the more recent story of globalization as a universally beneficial force is being questioned as its negative consequences become more visible. What this means is that we are living in a moment of narrative transition where the old stories are losing credibility, but new coherent stories have not yet emerged to replace them. This is a time of great uncertainty, but also of great creative potential. The stories we choose to tell in the coming decades may determine not only the fate of our species, but that of the entire biosphere. So, which stories should we tell? I don't have a definitive answer to this question, and I suspect no one does. But I can suggest some principles that could guide our search for wiser and more sustainable stories. First, we need stories that recognize our interdependence not only with other humans, but with the entire web of life on Earth. The story of the isolated individual, separate from everyone else, has never been more than a convenient fiction and a potentially dangerous one. In reality, none of us exists independently of the ecological, social, economic, and technological systems that sustain us. A truer story would see us as nodes in a vast network of connections, where the well-being of each part depends on the well-being of the whole. Second, we need stories that embrace complexity and uncertainty rather than seeking simplistic certainties. Many of our traditional stories promise clear answers and absolute security, whether through religious dogmas, political ideologies, or reductionist scientific theories. But reality is more complex and unpredictable than any of these stories can capture. A wiser approach would recognize the limits of our knowledge and the inevitability of uncertainty, seeing them not as threats to be eliminated, but as fundamental conditions that can keep us humble and open to continuous learning. Third, we need stories that balance our sense of agency with a sense of limits. The dominant modern stories present us with two extreme options. Either we are absolute masters of our destiny, capable of shaping the world at will through technology and ingenuity, or we are passive victims of forces beyond our control, whether divine, natural, or social. A more balanced perspective would acknowledge that we have considerable power to influence both our individual lives and the larger systems we inhabit, but that this power always operates within constraints and is intertwined with the actions of countless other agents, human and non-human alike. Fourth, we need stories that honor multiple forms of knowledge and value. The story of modern Western progress often privileges certain types of knowledge, scientific, technological, economic, over others, indigenous, artistic, spiritual, emotional. But each of these perspectives illuminates different aspects of reality, and all are necessary for a more complete understanding. A more integrative approach would recognize the legitimacy of diverse ways of knowing, seeking bridges between them rather than hierarchies. Finally, we need stories that help us find meaning and purpose in a world of constant change. Traditional stories often located meaning in some eternal and unchanging order, whether natural, social, or divine. But we are living in an era where change is the only constant, where our technologies, economies, societies, and even our bodies are transforming at an accelerated pace. How do we find a sense of purpose when everything is in flux? One possible answer is that meaning does not need to be found in permanent structures, but can emerge from the very processes of adaptation, learning, and care that life in a dynamic world requires of us. These principles do not constitute a new overarching story, but merely possible starting points. The creation of wiser and more sustainable stories will not be the work of a single person or group, but a collective project involving multiple voices and perspectives. And crucially, it is not about replacing one dominant story with another, but about cultivating an ecosystem of complementary stories that together can capture more of the complexity of human experience. This more plural and adaptive approach to the narratives that guide us is especially important in a historical moment of radical uncertainty such as ours. We are facing unprecedented challenges, from climate change to the revolution of artificial intelligence, whose outcomes are impossible to predict with confidence. Under these conditions, clinging rigidly to any single story, no matter how appealing, is a recipe for adaptive failure. Instead, we must cultivate narrative flexibility that allows us to respond creatively to constantly changing circumstances. This does not mean adopting a radical relativism where all stories are equally valid. Some stories are clearly more useful, more empirically grounded, more conducive to human and ecological flourishing than others. The challenge is to develop criteria for evaluating stories that do not depend on appeals to absolute truths or unquestionable authorities, but on an ongoing dialogue among different forms of knowledge and experience. One possible approach is to evaluate stories not only by their abstract truth, but by their practical consequences. How does this story affect our individual and collective well-being? How does it influence our relationships with other humans, other species, and the planet as a whole? A story that leads to widespread suffering, ecological destruction, or social fragmentation likely contains fundamental flaws, regardless of how compelling it may seem in theory. Another approach is to examine stories for their internal coherence and their compatibility with our best empirical knowledge. A story that constantly contradicts itself or ignores well-established evidence is less trustworthy than one that demonstrates logical consistency and alignment with observable facts. This does not mean we must reject stories containing mythological or metaphorical elements, but that we should be able to distinguish when a story operates on a literal versus a figurative level and evaluate each according to appropriate criteria. We may also consider the inclusiveness of a story, how much it recognizes and respects the diversity of human experience. Stories that universalize the experience of particular groups, treating it as representative of all humanity, tend to marginalize or exclude those whose lives follow different paths. More inclusive stories acknowledge the multiplicity of ways of being human without assuming that any one of them is the model for all others. Finally, we can evaluate stories by their openness to revision and evolution. Stories that present themselves as final and absolute truths, immune to criticism or modification, are inherently more dangerous than those that recognize their own provisional nature and remain open to continuous refinement in light of new information and perspectives. This openness is not a flaw, but a virtue, allowing stories to grow and adapt along with the communities that tell them. These criteria are not exhaustive, and their application is not an exact science. Different people and communities may weigh these factors differently, arriving at divergent evaluations of the same stories. But that too is part of the process. The ongoing dialogue among multiple perspectives is essential for the refinement and evolution of our shared stories. Here we touch on another crucial aspect of our relationship with the stories that shape our lives: the nature of personal identity. For what are we, ultimately, if not the stories we tell about ourselves? Our sense of being a continuous person over time with certain traits, values, relationships, goals, and memories is essentially a narrative construction. The self is not a fixed, substantial entity, but a continuous process of self-narration. This does not mean that personal identity is completely fictional or arbitrary. Our identity stories are constrained by countless factors: our biology, personal history, social relationships, and the cultures in which we are immersed. But we also have significant agency in constructing these stories. We can, to some extent, choose which events to highlight in our biographies, how to interpret them, and what kind of characters we want to be in the stories of our lives. This view of identity as narrative has profound implications. It suggests, for example, that significant changes in who we are often involve a reinterpretation of our life story. When someone undergoes a major transformation, whether a religious conversion, political shift, recovery from addiction or trauma, or a new understanding of gender identity or sexual orientation, they usually tell a new story about who they are, reinterpreting their past in light of their present understanding. These are not falsifications, but legitimate recontextualizations that reveal aspects of experience that could not be fully articulated within the previous story. It also suggests that the work of personal growth is in large part a work of narrative revision. We are not trapped by the stories given to us by our parents, teachers, cultures, or early traumas. We can, with effort and often with help, rewrite those stories in ways that open new possibilities for the future. Many psychological therapies, in fact, can be understood as processes of narrative revision, helping people develop more functional, flexible, and compassionate stories about themselves. But the idea of identity as narrative also has a darker side. If we are the stories we tell about ourselves, we are vulnerable to manipulation by those who can influence those stories. And never before in human history have so many powerful entities had such direct access to our personal narratives. Social media corporations collect vast amounts of data about our behaviors, preferences, and connections, using them to build predictive models that can anticipate and potentially shape our future choices. Politicians and ideological movements offer collective narratives that can provide a sense of meaning and belonging, but often at the cost of demonizing others and oversimplifying complex realities. Even our most intimate relationships can involve subtle forms of narrative manipulation, such as when an abusive partner tries to convince their victim that they are unworthy of love or incapable of independence. In the face of these pressures, maintaining narrative autonomy, the ability to actively participate in constructing the stories that define who we are, becomes a crucial aspect of personal freedom. This does not mean isolating ourselves from all external influences, which would be both impossible and undesirable. Rather, it means developing critical awareness of those influences, questioning the narratives presented to us, considering their origins and interests, and making deliberate choices about which stories to internalize and how to adapt them to our own circumstances and values. This narrative autonomy also extends to collective stories. As citizens, consumers, and members of religious, ethnic, or cultural communities, we have a responsibility to critically interrogate the stories we are offered and actively participate in co-creating wiser and fairer narratives. This may mean challenging national stories that glorify violent conquest while erasing the experiences of the conquered. It may mean questioning economic narratives that equate human worth with productivity or consumption. It may mean reimagining religious stories to emphasize compassion and justice instead of dogmatism or exclusivism. This work of narrative revision, both personal and collective, is especially crucial in our historical moment as we face challenges unprecedented in human experience. The stories of the past, as valuable as they are, cannot give us all the answers to problems our ancestors never had to face. We need the courage to imagine new stories that can guide us through this unfamiliar territory, stories that honor the accumulated wisdom of tradition while remaining open to emerging insights. It is important to recognize that this task of narrative reimagining is not merely intellectual, but deeply emotional and even spiritual. The stories that guide us are not just cognitive structures, but sources of meaning, purpose, and belonging. When those stories are destabilized, we may experience not only conceptual confusion, but deep existential disorientation, what some have called a sickness of the soul. Navigating this disorientation with integrity requires not only mental clarity, but also courage, compassion, and a willingness to dwell within uncertainty without resorting to false consolations. Here, contemplative traditions from various cultures can offer valuable resources. Meditation practices, for instance, can help us observe the continuous flow of our inner narratives without fully identifying with them, creating a space of freedom where new possibilities can emerge. Artistic traditions give us tools to explore alternative realities through imagination, expanding our ability to think beyond the limits of existing stories. And communal practices of dialogue, ritual, and celebration can help us cultivate a sense of connection and belonging that does not depend on exclusivist or dogmatic narratives. These practices are not merely optional complements to the work of narrative reimagining, but essential components. For we are not simply trying to create intellectually satisfying stories, but stories that can be lived, stories that can nurture real communities, guide real choices, and sustain real hope in difficult times. To do this, we must engage not only our minds, but also our bodies, emotions, relationships, and aesthetic sensibilities. In other words, we must cultivate an integral wisdom that goes beyond mere information or theory. This brings us back to the truth mentioned at the beginning of this video. The truth we must be ready for. There is no single story that will capture the whole truth of human experience or solve all our dilemmas. There is no end to the process of interpretation and reinterpretation through which we make sense of the world and ourselves. There is no final point where every question will be answered and every tension resolved. But that is not a cause for despair. On the contrary, it is an invitation to a more mature and creative way of engaging with reality. Instead of seeking absolute certainties or final answers, we can learn to inhabit questions with patience and curiosity. We can cultivate the ability to hold multiple perspectives in mind simultaneously, recognizing the partial value of each without elevating any to absolute status. We can develop what the poet Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in states of doubt and uncertainty without irritation. This is not relativism, the view that all stories are equally valid or invalid. It is pluralism, the recognition that multiple perspectives can capture different and complementary aspects of a reality that is inherently multifaceted. It is epistemic humility, the awareness of the limits of our knowledge and the fallibility of our beliefs. It is openness to constant revision in light of new evidence and arguments. And it is the understanding that the ultimate goal is not to reach a perfect and immutable story, but to participate responsibly in the ongoing process of telling and retelling the stories that shape our lives and our world. Living this way requires a particular kind of courage, the courage to face uncertainty without resorting to false consolations. It requires a particular kind of hope, the hope that does not depend on guarantees of success, but persists in the act of creation, even in the face of possible failure. And it requires a particular kind of love, the love that is not conditioned by narratives of merit or belonging, but extends itself to the full complexity of life, including those parts that do not easily fit into our preferred stories. The good news is that these qualities, this courage, hope, and love, are not foreign to the human experience. They have emerged again and again throughout our history, often in the darkest and most challenging moments. They are part of our inheritance as a species, resources we can access in times of need, and they can be cultivated through intentional practice, both individually and collectively. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps lacked words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to this channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share your questions and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era, not only to seek understanding, but to find wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with greater wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. In the end, the truth we must be ready for is not a proposition to be accepted or rejected, but an invitation to a way of being. It is the recognition that we are all storytellers engaged in the collective project of making sense of a world that exceeds our understanding. It is the awareness that the stories we tell have real consequences, shaping not only our individual perceptions, but the social, economic, and ecological worlds we inhabit together. And it is the understanding that though we can never completely escape stories, we can develop a more conscious, critical, and creative relationship with them. This narrative meta-awareness, this capacity to inhabit stories while maintaining a space of freedom from them, is perhaps the highest form of wisdom available to us as human beings. It does not offer definitive answers or unshakable certainties, but it gives us something potentially more valuable: the ability to navigate an increasingly complex world with flexibility, discernment, and compassion. In times of transition and turbulence like ours, these qualities may be our most reliable guides. So the invitation of this video is not to abandon all stories and seek some transcendent truth beyond them. It is to develop a more conscious and critical relationship with the stories that shape our lives, to participate more actively in their creation and revision, and to recognize our shared responsibility for the consequences they have in the world. It is an invitation to a more mature form of meaning-making, one that does not seek absolute certainties, but remains committed to the pursuit of truer, fairer stories more conducive to the flourishing of all life. If you've made it this far, you've probably already intuited at some level this truth about the constructed nature of much of what we take for granted as given reality. You've probably already felt the tension between the stories you've been told and your own lived experience. And you've probably already glimpsed the possibility of different stories, more inclusive, more sustainable, more aligned with what truly matters. My invitation is for you to take these intuitions seriously, to critically examine the stories that shape your perception and behavior, to seek out stories that more fully reflect the complexity and interconnectedness of life, and to participate actively in the ongoing work of telling new stories that can guide us toward wiser and fairer futures. It's not easy work. It goes against many tendencies of our culture, which often encourages us to consume stories passively rather than create them actively, to seek simplistic certainties rather than inhabit complexity, to identify rigidly with particular narratives rather than maintain a more fluid and critical relationship with them. But it is necessary work, and in the end, deeply rewarding, connecting us more authentically with ourselves, with one another, and with the living world of which we are part. The truth we must be ready for, then, is not a final truth that would replace all stories, but the truth about stories themselves, that they are human creations, powerful yet provisional, necessary yet not absolute, capable of freeing or imprisoning us depending on how we inhabit them. It is the truth that we are all active participants in the ongoing process of making sense of a world that always exceeds our categories and concepts. It is the truth of our shared responsibility for the stories we tell and for the world those stories help create. This is a truth that can be uncomfortable, even frightening at times, but it is also a truth that can free us from limiting dogmas, opening space for more flexible and creative ways of being in the world. It is a truth that honors our capacity for growth and transformation, both individually and collectively. And it is a truth that, once embraced, can help us navigate with greater wisdom the unprecedented challenges we face as a species. The question, then, is not whether we are ready to see the truth, as if there were a single definitive truth waiting to be discovered. The question is whether we are ready for a more mature and responsible relationship with the ongoing process of seeking truth, recognizing both its potentials and its limitations. Whether we are ready to become not passive consumers of prefabricated stories, but active co-creators of the narratives that shape our lives and our world. Whether we are ready for the continuous, challenging, and profoundly meaningful work of imagining and living stories that can guide us toward wiser, fairer, and more sustainable futures, that readiness, more than any particular belief or perspective, may well be the mark of philosophical maturity in our time.
The democratic conversation is breaking down. And every country has its own explanation. Like you talk to Americans, what's happening there between Democrats and Republicans? Why can't they agree on even the most basic facts? And they give you all these explanations about the unique conditions of American history and society. But you see the same thing in Brazil. You see the same thing in France, in the Philippines. So it can't be the unique conditions of this or that country. It's the underlying technological revolution.
I could get an AI to tell me that it feels pain and sadness.
That's a big problem because there is a huge incentive to train AIs to pretend to be alive. In truth, because we don't understand consciousness, we don't have any proof, even that other humans have feelings. I feel my own feelings, but I never feel your feelings. I only assume that you're also a conscious being. Society grants